After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
Canada has just dealt a blow that Trump will not be able to brush off on Twitter. Hundreds of billions of dollars that he boasted about are turning to dust because behind the scenes he was protecting not Americans, but the very billionaires he promised to put in their place. Today, the world is no longer afraid of threats from Washington, and Canada has become the first country to show its teeth. Trump thought he could impose his rules and force Canada to bend, but instead of being intimidated, Canada introduced a retroactive tax on Silicon Valley, forcing Amazon and Google to pay billions.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
And this is just the beginning. While Trump shouts about victories that never were, Canadian leader Mark Carney is building alliances with Europe, Asia, and Africa, cutting America off from what Trump considers his territory.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
The irony is that it is Trump who created Trudeau with his chaos, threats, and humiliation, turning him into his most dangerous opponent, who acts not with words but with precise surgical decisions, destroying America's fragile dominance in the global market.
That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
Have you ever heard of a president waging a trade war and making America poorer in the process? Trump likes to talk about how he has imposed tariffs on the world, but behind every dollar of these fees lies rising prices in American stores, at gas stations, and on grocery bills. Canada was the main supplier of fertilizers needed by American farmers, and now that trade threats are starting to block the flow, prices for corn, meat, and eggs are skyrocketing. These aren't visible taxes that can be challenged in court. They're hidden taxes that every American pays when they buy bread and milk. But Trump doesn't care. Because he's not protecting farmers, he's protecting the very giants who pay him for his loyalty.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
The world is no longer waiting. Canada is no longer waiting. Carney is no longer waiting. July 21st will be the day Canada strikes a real blow to the US economy if Trump continues with his threats and empty statements. This will not be a symbolic gesture, but targeted tariffs on agriculture, energy, and technology, and this time no one will come to America's rescue. While Trump plays his shows and promises deals that don't exist, Carney is signing real agreements with Europe, expanding trade corridors, and opening new markets from which American companies have cut themselves off with their own hands.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year, in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
And if you think this is an exaggeration, look at the statistics. Tourists from Canada are no longer traveling to the US, hotels are emptying, restaurants are losing money, and even Las Vegas is feeling the blows to its economy. But Trump continues to put on a show, calling it a victory. In reality, he is losing where he cannot afford to lose in the wallets of the people he promised to protect. And while America is losing ground, Canada is rising. There is no room for imaginary victories in this story. Strategy, not shouting, is what matters. And this time, shouting will not save him.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
Trump liked to repeat that he had made deals with China, the UK, and 4 other countries. But in reality, there was not a single real document to back up his words.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
All that lay on the table in the White House were drafts marked with a marker, and the cameras only filmed his gestures and statements, which he made with a confident smile, as if every word were gold, when in fact they concealed emptiness and fear. He said he could dictate prices to the world, that America holds all the cards, but every time he said those words, his eyes exchanged quick glances because they knew there were no cards, no leverage, only threats that crumbled at the seams when the world began to respond.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
Trump claimed that Europe and Asia were begging him for deals and that China was ready to sign documents that no one had seen at any moment. But in reality, business meetings ended in photo ops and negotiations collapsed because of his attempts to bargain like a market trader, demanding the impossible and threatening sanctions. He said that America was strong, but behind the scenes, lobbyists were running through the corridors of Congress, trying to persuade allies not to introduce retaliatory measures, not to slam doors, not to turn away from the U.S. Meanwhile, another process was underway in Canada, quiet and confident. Mark Carney, whom Trump called an insignificant official, was building a network of deals with Europe, Africa, and Southeast Asia, expanding corridors for Canadian trade and opening markets from which America had cut itself off with its own hands. He spoke to Macron without threats, to Merkel without shouting, to the Japanese Prime Minister without boasting, offering stability and partnership. And the world chose Carney because it was tired of chaos and wanted predictability.
But I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
American farmers who once believed that America First would support them began to notice that Canadian wheat was going to Africa, Canadian soybeans were going to Japan, and their own products were rotting in warehouses because the markets that Trump promised to subjugate were closing, fearing instability. He promised deals, but sanctions replaced them. He promised growth, but inflation was the only growth Americans felt when they went to the grocery store. Fictitious data hidden in White House reports spoke of a 12% increase in export contracts. But in fact, this figure was taken from a single month when a single shipment of fertilizer went to Latin America and was meaningless against the backdrop of collapsing feed prices in the US due to reduced supplies of Canadian fertilizer. Trump said that America is the center of trade, but Carney ironically noted in a small circle that the center of trade cannot even sign a coherent agreement with China because the president changes his demands every time after late-night calls from Silicon Valley donors. In reality, Trump did not just fail to conclude new deals, he destroyed old ones. He pulled out NAFTA documents, threatened to tear them to pieces, and then posed for photos with a new text that was only a slightly reworked version of the old agreement, but called it the best deal in history. It was a show, and everyone who worked at the State Department knew that behind the show were real losses and real tears from farmers who were losing markets, losing customers, losing money. Unlike Trump, Carney did not put on a show, he worked behind the scenes, and that is why his digital tax plan hit America like a hammer. The 3% tax on the profits of Amazon, Google, Meta, and other giants seemed like an act of aggression to Washington, but in reality it was a well-thought-out measure prepared after consultations with European allies who had already introduced similar taxes. Carney made no secret that this move was a signal that Canada would no longer allow money to be siphoned out of its economy without return, and that the era of tax loopholes for Silicon Valley was coming to an end. The US responded with threats of sanctions, and Trump publicly stated that Canada is playing with fire. But behind the scenes, it was clear that he was not ready for a real economic battle, because any attempt to block Canadian exports would cause a chain reaction in the US economy, raising prices for food, gasoline, and electronics. Because the reality was this: Trump had created an economy dependent on Canada, even as he publicly promised to make America independent. When Trump talked about his power to dictate prices, he forgot that the world had already stopped listening. India and Brazil began signing new agreements with Canada, Europe, and China, creating bypass routes that allowed them to avoid American tariff threats. China began buying Canadian wheat at a higher price than the Americans, simply to avoid unpredictable tariffs. European countries began rerouting their container ships through Montreal, bypassing New York, to avoid inspections and threats of delays. A fictional but possible scenario described in closed-door analytical reports. Canada is preparing a $1.2 billion contract with Egypt to supply grain and fertilizers, which could completely replace US supplies if the trade war continues. This was not mentioned in the news, but it was whispered at meetings of lobbyists who already understood that the situation was spiraling out of control. America liked to say that it was the center of the world, but the world began to revolve around other points, and Carney, whom Trump considered unimportant, turned out to be the leader of a new era of quiet trade without hysterics and threats. And American farmers, seeing their crops lose value and markets disappear, began to understand that Trump's promises were just echoes that did not bring profits. There were no deals, there were no markets, and inflation was rising. The world moved on, and America remained in the past, clinging to imaginary victories that existed only in speeches in front of cameras, while Carney concluded real agreements that contained no threats, only terms that suited both sides. So Trump, who promised greatness, turned into a salesman peddling illusions, while Canada turned those illusions into new opportunities for itself and for those who were willing to work without shouting and showmanship. While Trump continued to make loud statements about greatness and promises of deals that he could brag about on Twitter, he was in fact becoming a hostage to his own show of toughness. Not noticing how his threats were beginning to work against him, he claimed that the world depended on America, that Canada was afraid of border closures, but the real dependence was quite different. American farmers in rural areas who supported the slogan "America First" depended in practice every season on Canadian fertilizers and components, without which planting corn, soybeans, and feed production would have become a losing lottery. This is where the rift began, which Carney used as a weapon without firing a single shot. While Trump was shouting about victory from the podium and fantasizing about the hundreds of billions that his tariff policy was supposedly bringing in reality, food and feed bills were rising like mushrooms after rain. Potash and nitrogen fertilizers, a significant portion of which came from Canada, were threatened by the threat of broken deals, and even if the borders were not formally closed, delivery speeds slowed, logistics became more complicated, and prices skyrocketed. American farmers who had been confident of stability were receiving fertilizer bills 30% higher than a year ago and could no longer afford to invest in the new planting season without loans, which local banks were granting at huge interest rates, seeing the risks posed by political uncertainty. And while discontent was growing in rural states, Carney was doing his job. He signed long-term agreements with Europe to purchase Canadian grain and legumes, opened new trade routes with Egypt and Morocco, and built joint agricultural processing projects with India. And it was not noise, but quiet work that ensured stable demand for Canada, even when America was threatening the whole world with tariffs. Fictitious data from Carney's confidential report said that by the middle of the year, Canada had achieved a 19% increase in agricultural exports, despite crises and threats, and farmers' profits in some provinces had risen by 11% thanks to direct shipments to South Asia, while American farmers were forced to sell their crops at a loss just to pay off their debts. Trump, who once promised to protect agriculture, turned out to be a defender in words only, because when Washington decided who to give in to on tariffs in order to score political points, the interests of farmers were the first to go, leaving them alone with growing debts and collapsing prices for their products. Meanwhile, a hidden threat that was little talked about in the media was the digital tax that Canada introduced against tech giants. For Trump, Silicon Valley was sacrosanct because it was backed by lobbyists and money for future campaigns. And when Canada introduced a tax on revenue, not just profits, the largest US corporations felt the blow. At first, it seemed like a symbolic move. But when Amazon, Google, and Meta did the math, it turned out they owed billions, including retroactive payments dating back to 2022. A fictional but realistic detail: in one internal meeting at Amazon's headquarters, a plan was discussed to temporarily raise prices for some services in Canada to offset the losses. But this was not done for fear that Carney would initiate an investigation into monopolization. It was a clash of two worlds: Trump, who was willing to bow to tech giants for their loyalty, and Carney, who was not afraid to pressure them for the sake of his country's budget. Meanwhile, prices in the US continued to rise. Trump claimed that inflation was under control, but every trip to the store for Americans meant higher prices for meat, eggs, milk, and bread. Why? Because the tariffs that Trump touted as a victory were passed on to ordinary families. Hidden duties on components, ingredients, transportation, and fertilizers were woven into the chain and made every product several cents or even dollars more expensive. And the more Trump threatened the world, the higher these prices rose, turning every victory speech into a hidden tax on the middle class who believed in the slogans but paid for them themselves. And while the US administration insisted that the situation was temporary, prices in Canada remained stable thanks to controlled policies and partnerships from Europe and Asia that Carney had built up over the past 2 years. Inside the White House, however, there were other conversations that the general public never heard about. A fictional but emotionally plausible scene. At one of the closed meetings, Trump, angry about his falling ratings, threw a folder with inflation analysis on the table, shouting that the people don't understand that this is for their own good. But the people understood that there was no good, only rising prices and unfulfilled promises, while Carney, meanwhile, did not raise his voice, but simply expanded the Canadian market by attracting new partners and investors and creating security of supply for his citizens. At the same time, US states dependent on Canadian tourists began to see a decline in visitor numbers. Las Vegas, which is rarely mentioned in the context of trade, felt the drop in revenue from Canadian tourists, who used to spend millions of dollars over the weekend. Hotels lost occupancy, restaurants lost customers, and stores saw their revenues decline. All of this was not the result of sanctions, but of the atmosphere of threats and trade war that Washington was fueling. Trump continued to claim that we hold all the cards, but the reality was different. The cards were slipping out of his hands, and the world no longer wanted to play by the rules of threats. Carney knew the price of silence. He saw how the chaos in America could be used to strengthen his own economy. And while American farmers, families, and small businesses paid for tariffs with their own money, Carney quietly built trade, where every agreement brought Canada not only money but also a reputation as a stable partner in a world tired of shouting and tantrums. So against a backdrop of inflation and rising prices in America, Canada gained a new status, while Trump, continuing to threaten and brag about numbers, actually became a hostage to his own promises, turning loud slogans into dust in his hands. The American dream of world domination was crumbling not in loud scandals, but in quiet cracks created by people like Mark Carney, who turned Trump's slogans into meaningless noise. While Trump talked about victories and promised that America would be great again, Canada methodically showed that the era of shouting and threats was coming to an end. It was at this time that the real consequences began, which were hardly covered on television, but were felt by everyone who worked in hotels, casinos and restaurants in border towns, and tourist states such as Nevada and Michigan.